Alright, what's up guys? Thanks for tuning in to Fancy Free Philosophy. This will be a fun one, especially if you're interested in American history. So, some people like to say that this country was built and founded on slavery, and that the founding fathers and framers of the Constitution were pro-slavery, white supremacists, things of that nature, and the Constitution and Declaration of Independence are worthless because all men are created equal, was not intended to include blacks, but in fact it was intended to include them and everyone. And the framers instituted these types of principles in the Constitution and Declaration in hopes that slavery would end in the early 1800s, 50 years before it finally was. So 36 out of the 39 framers of the Constitution were anti-slavery. The Republican, Abraham Lincoln, proved that in his lawyerly way in his arguments against slavery. We'll get into the specifics of that in a minute or two. But yeah, of course the Democrat Party was the party of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, but we'll discuss that in another video. In fact, the Declaration's author, Thomas Jefferson, wrote a lengthy anti-slavery rant into the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. But during a meeting of the Continental Congress, that's what it was called originally before we were officially a country, that anti-slavery passage pissed off many Southern delegates, so they demanded its removal before they would sign it, which upset Jefferson quite a bit. So this right here demonstrates exactly why the founders could not ban slavery during America's founding. Not wouldn't, but couldn't. Why? Because America would have never existed, therefore unable to grant everyone freedom later on. Why is that? Because England would have destroyed us in the war. With abolition in 1776, Southern colonies would have left, just like they did 85 years later. We barely won the war as is. It dragged on for 6 long years, and at certain points looked hopeless. So I think even if we lost 1 or 2 states, we might have lost, because it was so neck and neck for years. But yeah, in year 6, we cornered half the British Army at Yorktown, and the French Navy blockaded the city for us. This was the last battle of the Revolutionary War. So without the Southern troops united with us, we would have lost, definitely. And the entire world may still live under monarchy. We were the first democracy in a few hundred years, if not like 600 or 700 years. So we're getting to the Lincoln stuff now right after this. So slavery in America existed since at least 1619, facilitated under British rule in King George. By British ships importing slaves to the New World for wealthy businessmen and who could afford them to settle land and set up farming plantations or just have them as personal house cleaning slaves and stuff. Nearly 2/3 of the history of North American slavery occurred before the American Revolution. The founders were contending with an institution established long before they were born. Probably about 120 to 130 years before their births, because a lot of them were born in 1740, 1750, because a good portion of them were like in their mid-20s or even early 20s, some of them, during the Revolution. So here's Lincoln's evidence for over 90% of the framers of the Constitution being anti-slavery. At the Congress of Confederation in 1784, 4 future signers of the Constitution were asked to vote to prohibit slavery in the immense Northwest Territory that would come to include the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. 3 out of 4 of them voted to ban slavery. Then 3 years later, a similar Northwest prohibition came up for consideration, and 2 future framers voted for a ban. Then, in 1789, at the first official gathering of Congress, presided by George Washington, all 16 framers present voted unanimously to enforce the slavery ban of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance that I just mentioned right before this. Then, in 1804, 2 framers were called upon to adjudicate similar restrictions in the newly acquired Louisiana Territory. Both voted for federal restrictions, including a ban on future importation of slaves from abroad. Then in 1820, When Congress considered the Missouri Compromise, two surviving framers cast votes, one to ban slavery extension and then one to allow it. So, excluding double counting, 23 of the 39 framers left voting records on the question of slavery expansion. 21 out of those 23 voted to ban or restrict it, leaving 16 framers who left no voting record on the subject, but there's more information we have to determine how they would have voted. So these 16 remaining include Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Gouverneur Morris. With the exception of John Rutledge, Lincoln noted that all the others were confirmed anti-slavery men. So out of these 16, only John Rutledge was not among the anti-slavery men. Abraham Lincoln recorded his final tally of 36-3, or 36 out of the 39 framers of the Constitution, a decisive endorsement by the framers of the Republican Party's position on slavery restriction. Lincoln challenged the Democrats to name a single person, not just a single founder, but any single individual of the founding era who claimed that blacks were not included as men in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal thing. So that challenge was never met by a Democrat of Lincoln's time and has not been met to this day. Keep in mind, the Democrats were the party of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation. That's why he made that challenge. Alright, so to wrap it up here, here's some more interesting info. Founders George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe were all presidents, all Southerners, and all of them railed against slavery. Washington and Jefferson both freed their slaves upon death. That was the only legal way to do so in pro-slavery Virginia. And if they did so illegally, their political opponents could have turned them in. Washington married a woman who was very prominent and owned slaves, so that's where his slaves came from. And then Jefferson was born into a slave-owning family. Washington said, quote, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it," speaking of slavery. James Madison devised numerous emancipation schemes and termed slavery, quote, "the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man," unquote. Alexander Hamilton was a co-founder of the New York Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves. It's a long title, but a good cause. John Jay was elected president of that society, and was, of course, a prominent founder, and was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, actually. And then Benjamin Franklin was elected president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He never owned slaves at any point in his life, and he termed slavery, quote, "an atrocious debasement of human nature." Then John Adams also never owned slaves at any point in his life, and he sought, quote, "the eventual total extirpation of slavery," unquote. So that wraps it up here, guys. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and if you like the video, click like. That helps me out quite a bit. And then if you subscribe, remember to click the bell, because otherwise you only get about 10 to 20% of the notifications for new videos. That's what I've noticed. But yeah, anyway, I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll catch you guys really soon.